warm and hazy, was just beginning its slow climb into the sky over the meticulously manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates. In one of the perfectly beige houses, with its precisely trimmed boxwoods and a bird feeder that hung at exactly the HOA-approved height, lived a woman named, well, most people just called her Mrs. Henderson. Or sometimes, when she was out of earshot, a less polite version of that. Mrs. Henderson considered herself a guardian of Willow Creek's pristine standards. Every blade of grass out of place, every slightly chipped piece of garden art, every car parked a fraction too far over the designated line. These were affronts to her sense of order, and she took it upon herself to address them. With vigor, across the street, in a house painted a slightly bolder shade of blue than most in the neighborhood, a fact that had indeed been noted in Mrs. Henderson's mental ledger, lived a man named David. David worked from home, a quiet software developer who mostly kept to himself. His biggest sin, in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, was a certain laissez-faire attitude towards the rigid rules of the Homeowners Association. It started small, as these things often do. A basketball hoop that remained at the end of his driveway, a little too late into the evening. Some wind chimes on his porch that Mrs. Henderson deemed, quote, excessive and disruptive to the tranquility. Each infraction was met with a polite, yet firm email from Mrs. Henderson, detailing the specific violation and citing the relevant section of the HOA handbook. David, a man who preferred coding to confrontation, usually complied quickly, moving the basketball hoop, taking down the wind chimes. But then came the garden gnomes. David had a small patch of garden by his front walkway, a cheerful collection of sunflowers and zinnias. Tucked amongst the blooms were 3 small, brightly painted garden gnomes. They weren't offensive, not garish, just there. Mrs. Henderson, however, found them unacceptable. She marched across the street one sunny Tuesday morning, her sensible walking shoes clicking softly on the pavement. David was tending his roses when she approached, a determined set to her jaw. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice measured and slow, each word enunciated with precision. "I must bring something to your attention regarding the decorations in your front garden." David straightened up, a pair of gardening gloves in his hand. He looked at her, a hint of weariness in his eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. What is it today?" "The gnomes, Mr. Miller," she stated, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "They are not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of Willow Creek Estates." David frowned. "The gnomes? They're just little garden ornaments. I didn't think they'd be a problem." Mrs. Henderson produced a neatly folded copy of the HOA guidelines from her purse. She unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and pointed to a specific clause. Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 2 clearly states that all lawn ornaments must be of a tasteful and understated nature and must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. These gnomes hardly qualify as understated, and I certainly don't recall seeing any application for their approval. David sighed. "Mrs. Henderson, they're just a bit of fun. They make me smile when I come home. The purpose of this community, Mr. Miller," she replied, her voice unwavering, "is to maintain a consistent level of property value and a harmonious environment for all residents. Whimsical novelties such as these detract from that goal." This exchange became a pattern, a slightly overgrown hedge, a visitor's car parked on the street for longer than the allotted time, a faint sound of music drifting from David's open window on a Saturday afternoon. Each perceived transgression was meticulously documented and politely, yet firmly, addressed by Mrs. Henderson. David, though generally a patient man, began to feel the weight of her constant scrutiny. It felt as though he was living under a microscope, every small detail of his life subject to the approval of Mrs. Henderson and her interpretation of the Willow Creek Estate handbook. One afternoon, David was washing his car in his driveway. He was enjoying the sunshine, the rhythmic swish of the sponge, the simple act of cleaning. Mrs. Henderson emerged from her house, carrying a small notepad. "Mr. Miller," she called out, her voice carrying across the quiet street. David straightened up, the soapy sponge dripping in his hand. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson. I couldn't help but notice," she said, approaching him slowly, her gaze fixed on the water running down his driveway, "that you appear to be using an excessive amount of water to wash your vehicle. Section 6, subsection D of the HOA guidelines specifically requests residents to be mindful of water conservation, especially during peak hours." David stared at her, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm just washing my car. It's not like I'm flooding the neighborhood." "Nevertheless, Mr. Miller," she persisted, her voice calm but firm, "it is important that we all adhere to the guidelines. Every drop counts." She made a note on her pad. The constant corrections, the unwavering adherence to rules that often seemed trivial, were starting to wear David down. He felt like he was walking on eggshells in his own home, constantly anticipating the next polite but pointed observation from across the street. One evening, there was a neighborhood barbecue in the small community park. Most residents mingled amiably, chatting and laughing. David stood a little apart, nursing a soda. Mrs. Henderson approached him, a plate of potato salad in her hand. "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone surprisingly conversational. David turned, a little surprised. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson." "Lovely evening, isn't it?" she commented, gesturing vaguely at the gathering. "Yes, it is," David agreed cautiously. There was a moment of silence, an unusual lull in their interactions. "You know, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Henderson continued, her gaze drifting towards his house, "sometimes I think people misunderstand my intentions." David raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I only want what's best for Willow Creek," she explained, her voice a little softer than usual. "These rules, they're in place for a reason. To protect our property values, to maintain a certain standard." "I understand that, Mrs. Henderson," David replied slowly. "But sometimes it feels like the focus is on the small things, the things that don't really matter." Mrs. Henderson looked at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. Perhaps you have a point, Mr. Miller." The conversation didn't suddenly transform her. She didn't suddenly declare that garden gnomes were a delightful addition to the landscape. But for the first time, David saw a flicker of something beyond the unwavering adherence to rules in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, there was a person under the self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek standards. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The barbecue wound down, and neighbors began to drift back to their homes. David watched Mrs. Henderson walk back to her perfectly beige house, her posture still upright, her movements still precise. He looked at his own blue house, at the small patch of garden where the three cheerful gnomes stood amongst the fading blooms. They still made him smile, and maybe, just maybe tomorrow, when Mrs. Henderson glanced over, she wouldn't see a violation. Maybe she would just see a garden. The crickets began their evening chorus, a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet of Willow Creek Estates. The day was ending, and with it, another chapter in the ongoing story of David and the woman known as the Karen of their little corner of suburban America. A story that, like the slow turning of the seasons, was bound to continue. One meticulously documented infraction at a time,